Let me ask you something. What's the worst punishment you can imagine? Execution, torture, maybe being burned alive. Well, Genghis Khan would laugh at that, because what he did to his enemies makes every horror movie look like a bedtime story. And listen, don't even think about clicking away, because by the end of this, you'll realize how lucky you are to be living in the 21st century, scrolling YouTube instead of kneeling in front of the Great Khan. So before we dive into rivers of skulls, suffocation under carpets, and a king who literally had molten metal poured down his throat, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, after hearing this story, you're going to want someone to remind you that humanity did eventually calm down. Well, mostly. Temujin's birth around 1162 took place on the harsh Mongolian steppe, a land where survival depended on kinship, alliances, and the strength to repel endless enemies. Yet even at his arrival, violence marked his destiny. His father, Yesge, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, had stolen Temujin's mother, Holon, from her husband in an ambush. This act, though common among steppe tribes, set the pattern. Temujin's very existence was rooted in abduction and bloodshed. The boy's name carried omen. Temujin was said to be named after a Tatar warrior his father had just slain. In Mongol culture, such naming carried meaning. The spirit of a fallen enemy bound to the child, as if his life began not with innocence, but with the shadow of vengeance. For a short time, Temujin's future looked secure. His father, though not the most powerful leader, commanded respect and alliances. Yet this security shattered when Temujin was only 9. Yesge, while arranging his son's betrothal, was poisoned by Tatars, ancient enemies who sought revenge. The chieftain's slow death left his family vulnerable. On the steppe, leadership was not inherited by blood alone. It required strength, loyalty, and the ability to command warriors. Temujin, still a child, possessed none of these. With Yesge gone, the family's allies abandoned them. Hun, left with Temujin and his siblings, was cast aside by her husband's followers. Once surrounded by warriors, she now stood alone with children, forced to forage like outcasts. The Mongolian steppes were unforgiving, brutal winters, scarce food, constant raids. What followed was starvation. Temujin and his siblings scraped for roots, hunted small animals, and fought rival clans simply to live another day. Betrayal came not only from outside. Among his brothers, rivalry turned savage. The struggle for survival was so extreme that one of Temujin's half-brothers, Bakhtr, hoarded food and threatened the family's fragile existence. In a chilling act, Temujin, together with his younger brother Khasar, murdered Bakhtr. It was not only an act of desperation, but a lesson. Power on the steppe belonged to those ruthless enough to seize it, even at the cost of blood kin. But if family could betray, so too could strangers. Soon after, Temujin was captured by the Taichiad, a rival clan that viewed him as a potential threat. For months, the boy was held in captivity, treated as a servant, his neck shackled with a wooden collar. The humiliation of this bondage scarred him. To live in chains on the open steppe was the deepest disgrace for a Mongol. Yet Temujin endured. Eventually, he escaped, aided by a sympathetic guard. This escape was more than freedom. It was the first taste of survival through resilience, cunning, and a will stronger than his captors. This crucible of cruelty forged his character. Unlike other leaders who rose from noble privilege, Temujin's childhood was one of suffering so profound it reshaped his understanding of loyalty and power. For him, loyalty was never assumed. It was enforced, demanded, and rewarded only through absolute submission. The betrayals he suffered as a boy hardened into policy as a man. Those who abandoned him would face annihilation, and those who remained faithful would be bound by blood, brotherhood, and reward. The Mongol world itself was a furnace of violence. Tribes raided one another, enslaving women, massacring enemies, and seizing herds. Violence was not an exception, but the foundation of existence. Temujin's formative years revealed this truth in its most brutal form, that survival belonged to the ruthless, and that compassion often meant death. Yet within this brutality lay vision. The boy who starved in the snow, who killed his own brother, who wore the collar of a slave, would grow to see unity as the only weapon strong enough to break the cycle of betrayal. But unity in his hands was never gentle. It would be carved through terror, loyalty forged under threat of extermination. Historians often debate whether Temujin's childhood merely reflected the norms of his time, or whether it uniquely brutalized him into something more. What is undeniable is that his early years stripped him of illusions. He learned that betrayal was inevitable, that mercy could not be trusted, and that survival demanded preemptive cruelty. The conqueror, later known as Genghis Khan, was not born in glory but in degradation. The abandoned boy of the steppes carried those scars into adulthood, and with them, he reshaped the world. His empire would one day stretch across continents, built on the bones of millions. But beneath the vastness of his conquests lay the shadow of his earliest memories, hunger gnawing at his belly, betrayal cutting through trust, and blood staining family bonds. When Temujin rose from outcast to leader, he knew that raw strength alone could not hold tribes together. On the Mongolian steppe, alliances shifted like the wind. Clans betrayed one another for herds, for brides, for revenge. To unite this world of shifting loyalties, he forged something harsher than tradition, a code of law that would bind his followers in fear and obedience. This code became known as the Yasa. Unlike the written laws of settled civilizations, the Yasa was unwritten, carried in memory, enforced by terror, and absolute in its reach. It was said to come directly from Genghis Khan himself, the living source of justice. To obey was life. To defy was annihilation. The laws were not designed to offer fairness or mercy, but to create unshakable order in a society where chaos had once reigned. Theft, the most common crime on the steppes, was punished with death. A man who stole a horse, a sheep, or even a minor possession faced execution. But punishment did not stop with the thief. Families could be erased, entire households executed, for the crime of a single member. Genghis Khan understood the psychology of terror. By making punishment collective, he ensured that families would police their own, eliminating disobedience at its roots. Betrayal of loyalty was met with even harsher consequences. To abandon one's post in battle meant execution without honor. A warrior who deserted his comrade in combat would not only die, but his family could be enslaved, his clan marked in disgrace. In Temujin's memory lingered the betrayal his own family had suffered after his father's death. The Yasa became his answer. Betrayal would not be tolerated, it would be annihilated. Sexual crimes were treated with the same severity. Adultery was punishable by death. An abduction of women outside Genghis Khan's sanction could lead to execution or mutilation. This was not driven by a sense of morality in the modern sense, but by control. Women were property of the clan, and violation of that order threatened stability. Genghis Khan himself had been born from abduction, and perhaps he recognized the chaos it caused. His laws sought to prevent such disorder, through punishment so severe that few dared risk it. Religious freedom, strangely, was permitted under the Yasa. All faiths, whether Buddhist, Muslim, or Christian, could be practiced without interference. Yet this tolerance was not born of compassion. It was strategy. Genghis Khan cared little for belief, so long as it did not challenge his authority. Those who defied him in the name of faith, however, met the same fate as any other rebel: death, often delivered with public brutality, to remind all that the Khan was above gods and men alike. Execution under the Yasa was not a uniform affair. Hanging was rare. Instead, death was delivered in ways that erased dignity. Strangulation with a rope, crushing beneath stones, or being cut open were methods reported in accounts. Nobles could be killed without spilling blood, suffocated or broken, preserving a strange ritual respect while ensuring the body never again stood in defiance. For common criminals, death was often swift, brutal, and meant as a spectacle for others. The Yasa also extended into military discipline. Warriors were organized into strict units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and disobedience within these ranks was crushed immediately. To flee the battlefield, to neglect duty, or to disobey an order was punished not only with personal death but with execution of comrades. The terror was designed to make obedience automatic. A warrior might fear his enemies, but he feared the Khan's law more. Even hunting was regulated. Massive hunts, involving thousands of riders, were conducted not merely for food, but as military training. To kill an animal out of turn or to break the discipline of the hunt meant punishment as severe as treason. In this way, the Yasa transformed even survival into a ritual of obedience. Historians debate whether every detail of the Yasa truly originated from Genghis Khan or was expanded by successors. But what cannot be doubted is the legacy of fear it left. It was not law as we understand it, rooted in justice or fairness, but law as terror, an extension of one man's will. In a world where clans had once valued freedom and independence, Genghis Khan imposed order with blood and iron. The brilliance of the Yasa was not in its fairness, but in its merciless clarity. There were no loopholes, no forgiveness, no appeal. Everyone knew the price of defiance, and so obedience became survival. The terror of punishment was so deep that it outlived the Khan himself, carried forward by generations of Mongol rulers, shaping not only armies but empires. For Temujin, who had once starved in the wilderness, betrayed and abandoned, law became the weapon to prevent chaos. Mercy had no place in his vision. To him, mercy was weakness, and weakness destroyed nations. The Yasa was not justice. It was survival enforced through fear. By the early 13th century, the Mongols had moved westward in an unstoppable tide, sweeping across Central Asia and Persia. Their leader, Genghis Khan, demanded absolute submission from cities that stood in their path. Those who resisted were shown no mercy, their ruins left as warnings to others. In this grim theater of conquest, few tragedies equaled the destruction of Nishapur in 1221. Nishapur was no mere town. It was a flourishing center of trade, art, and scholarship, nestled in northeastern Persia. For centuries it had produced poets, artisans, and scientists. Its walls held not just soldiers, but families, merchants, and scholars who had never known the terror soon to arrive at their gates. Yet when Mongol horsemen appeared, the city became a stage for vengeance beyond comprehension. The chain of events that led to its destruction began with the death of Tokachi, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, during the Mongol siege of the city. Tokachi, married to one of the Khan's daughters, fell in battle at the hands of Nishapur's defenders. In Mongol culture, the death of such a figure was not merely personal grief. It was an insult, a challenge to the Khan's supremacy, and a wound that demanded repayment in blood. When news reached Genghis Khan, his response was absolute. He gave the city to his daughter, Tokachi's widow, to decide its fate. Her demand was simple vengeance for her husband's death. Her will became law, and the order was passed to Subutai and Tolui, Genghis Khan's trusted generals. What followed was not a battle, but an extermination. Once the walls of Nishapur fell, the massacre began. Men were dragged into the streets and executed in masses. Accounts from Persian chroniclers, though varying in numbers, describe a slaughter so vast it defies imagination. Some claimed 1.7 million souls were killed, a number likely exaggerated, yet symbolic of the scale of destruction. Others wrote of 200,000 dead. Whatever the exact figure, the message was clear: Nishapur was to be erased. The killing did not spare women or children. Entire families were cut down. Infants were executed alongside their mothers, elders butchered with the young. For the Mongols, the massacre was not madness but method. Total annihilation was a calculated strategy. Terror was their weapon, and extermination their warning to any who thought resistance could stand. Reports from survivors describe the aftermath in chilling detail. The city's artisans were executed, scholars slaughtered, its libraries and treasures consumed in fire. The streets became rivers of blood, and corpses piled higher than the walls they once defended. Chroniclers wrote of pyramids of skulls rising where houses once stood, deliberate monuments to fear. Mongol soldiers collected the heads of the slain and arranged them into massive towers, a grotesque architecture of terror. Such acts were not only vengeance but propaganda. The Mongols understood the psychology of fear as well as the mechanics of war. To leave mountains of skulls was to send a message across Persia. Resistance meant not defeat but obliteration. In city after city, news of Nishapur spread, and countless others surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid the same fate. The death of Nishapur became the death of defiance. The annihilation was also symbolic within the Mongol worldview. Genghis Khan had long punished betrayal and resistance with extermination, but Nishapur carried a personal wound. His daughter's grief translated into policy, her vengeance etched into history. By granting her the right to decide, Genghis revealed both the cold pragmatism and the merciless cruelty of his reign. Even family grief became empire's law, and mercy was a luxury the Khan refused to allow. In the ashes of the city, survivors described silence so profound it felt unnatural. Markets were gone, mosques destroyed, schools reduced to rubble. The Mongols left only ruin. The city that once hummed with trade and culture now echoed with nothing but wind. Generations of knowledge, poetry, and artistry perished with its people, extinguished in a matter of days. Historians have long debated the accuracy of the numbers reported. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated death tolls, and the figure of 1.7 million is implausible. Yet even if the numbers were smaller, the destruction was total in its effect. Nishapur was not merely conquered. It was erased from history's living map, reduced to memory, to ash, and to terror. The lesson of Nishapur was clear to all who heard it. Resistance to the Khan was not bravery, it was suicide. In its wake, other Persian cities weighed their choices carefully. Some surrendered immediately, opening their gates to Mongol rule. Others resisted, and met the same fate, though few ever suffered as completely as Nishapur. For Genghis Khan, the massacre served both personal and strategic ends. He avenged his son-in-law, upheld his daughter's demand, and reinforced his reputation as a ruler whose mercy could not be begged. His empire advanced not only through cavalry and siegecraft, but through psychological devastation. Nishapur became a word spoken in whispers, a symbol of what awaited the disobedient. Centuries later, the memory of that massacre still lingers in Persian chronicles. The skull pyramids, the slaughter of innocents, the silencing of a city. These horrors became the legacy of conquest. Nishapur's fall revealed the dark heart of empire. That greatness, when forged in blood, carries with it the weight of immeasurable suffering. The Mongol Empire was built on terror as much as on cavalry and strategy. Cities fell not only because of military defeat, but because of fear so profound it broke resistance before battles began. To cultivate this terror, the Mongols developed executions that were not merely punishments but public displays of suffering. Torture became spectacle, and spectacle became policy. From the earliest campaigns, Genghis Khan and his successors understood the psychology of fear. To kill one man was ordinary. To kill him in a way that lingered in memory was power. The Mongols wielded execution as a weapon sharper than swords. They crafted methods of death that erased honor, dignity, and hope, leaving survivors haunted long after the victims were gone. Among the most infamous punishments was slow crushing. Nobles captured in rebellion were sometimes executed not with blades but with weight. Stones were piled upon the body, breaking bones and suffocating life inch by inch. The victims' screams were not silenced quickly, they became the warning to others. To watch such a death was to learn that disobedience brought not only defeat, but agony stretched into hours. Equally chilling was execution by boiling. Chronicles from Persia and China record instances where captured enemies were cast into great cauldrons of water or oil. The searing pain, the rising steam, the helpless struggle, it was meant to strip away the illusion of human strength. No warrior's courage could survive boiling flesh. The Mongols ensured that those who watched carried the memory forever, spreading stories of horror to distant lands. Suffocation beneath carpets became another tool of terror. Unlike crushing or boiling, this method was often reserved for high-born captives, particularly nobles or rulers. In Mongol belief, spilling noble blood could defile the earth. Instead, their enemies were wrapped in carpets or heavy cloth and trampled under horses or crushed until life left them. This method preserved ritual while ensuring a slow, degrading death. For onlookers, the image was unforgettable. A once proud ruler silenced beneath woven fabric, dignity erased, body broken without a single drop of blood shed upon the ground. Public executions were not limited to individuals. Entire populations faced collective punishments, where torture merged with massacre. Skilled artisans or soldiers might be spared, but resistors often suffered gruesome deaths before their communities. Burning alive, mutilation, And dismemberment served not only as retribution, but as education. The Mongols taught submission through horror. The spectacle extended beyond the body. In some cases, the Mongols used executions to send symbolic messages. Captured leaders were paraded, humiliated, and then killed in ways that stripped them of all status. One account describes the execution of Khwarezmian princes who, after their empire's fall, were suffocated in carpets and left unburied. The dishonor was as potent as the pain, a reminder that resistance erased both life and legacy. For the Mongols, these spectacles were not senseless cruelty. They were deliberate tools of conquest. The empire stretched across vast lands, from China to the Middle East, and no army could physically garrison every city. Instead, fear became their soldier, spreading faster than horsemen. When news of slow crushing or boiling reached distant rulers, resistance often collapsed without a fight. The terror of what might happen proved stronger than swords. Religious leaders, nobles, and warriors alike feared these punishments. The Mongols targeted elites deliberately, ensuring that their deaths were remembered by the masses. By killing rulers in humiliating ways, they destroyed not only bodies but symbols of authority. A king boiled alive was not only a corpse, he was a shattered image of power, a warning that no throne stood above the Khan. Yet brutality was not unthinking. Genghis Khan reserved such spectacles for those who defied him openly. Cities that surrendered often escaped with their lives, their people taxed but spared. In this way, terror and mercy worked together. The memory of torture drove people to obedience, while the promise of survival encouraged submission. It was a balance of cruelty and pragmatism, wielded with precision. Still, the psychological scars outlasted the empire. Chroniclers from Persia, Russia, and China wrote of Mongol executions with horror decades after the events. Tales of nobles suffocated beneath carpets or men boiled alive passed from generation to generation, becoming legends of terror. Even when the Mongols no longer ruled, the memory of their punishments haunted the lands they had once conquered. What made these executions uniquely terrifying was their transformation into spectacle. They were designed to be seen, to be remembered, to echo in the minds of survivors. Unlike hidden cruelty, Mongol torture was public policy. It was theater with the highest stakes, where the audience learned submission through the suffering of others. Historians still debate the exact frequency of these punishments. Some argue that chroniclers exaggerated numbers or methods, crafting horror stories to explain Mongol dominance. Yet even exaggeration speaks to reality. The Mongols cultivated a reputation so dreadful that rumor alone subdued nations. Whether every tale was true mattered little, fear itself was the weapon, and stories of boiling cauldrons or suffocating carpets served its purpose. What remains undeniable is the deliberate use of cruelty as strategy. The Mongols knew that a single terrifying death could prevent thousands of battles. Their empire expanded not only on the strength of cavalry, but on the silence of cities too afraid to resist. Torture was not merely punishment. It was spectacle, propaganda, and conquest woven into one. In the year 1221, as the Mongol armies advanced across Persia, the ancient city of Merv faced an impossible choice. For centuries, Merv had stood as a jewel of learning and commerce, a hub of scholars, artisans, and merchants along the Silk Road. Its markets thrived with goods from India, Arabia, and China. Its libraries held volumes of philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. But when Genghis Khan's forces arrived, none of this mattered. What mattered was survival. The Mongols were already infamous for their brutality. The stories of Nishapur's annihilation had spread across the land. Cities knew the pattern: resistance meant death, surrender meant a chance at life. And so the people of Merv, fearful, desperate, and clinging to hope, chose surrender. They opened their gates, laid down their weapons, and trusted in the Khan's word of mercy. The promise was deception. Genghis Khan had no intention of sparing them. For him, mercy was not a gift but a weapon, offered only to ensure submission. Once the city was under Mongol control, his orders were given. The population was to be executed in its entirety. What followed was one of the most catastrophic massacres recorded in human history. Chroniclers vary in their numbers, some claiming as many as 700,000 people, others writing of over 1 million. Even if exaggerated, The scale of death was beyond comprehension. Entire populations, men, women, children, and the elderly, were herded outside the city walls. The executions were systematic. Groups of civilians were divided among the Mongol soldiers, each warrior tasked with killing hundreds. This was not chaos but organization, a massacre carried out with the same precision as a military campaign. The slaughter continued for days. Blades rose and fell, arrows flew, and bodies piled until the fields outside Merv became oceans of blood and bone. Unlike battles, where warriors might meet their deaths with honor, Merv's citizens were helpless. Families clung to each other as they awaited execution. Mothers tried to shield children, elders prayed, but no prayer or plea altered their fate. The Mongols spared only artisans and those deemed useful for the empire. For the rest, there was no escape. The city itself, once among the greatest in the Islamic world, was emptied of life. Its libraries were destroyed, its mosques burned, its gardens trampled under hooves. The cultural wealth of centuries vanished in days. Merv, which had been described by travelers as a paradise of learning and prosperity, became a wasteland. The massacre at Merv was not only an act of vengeance but a calculated message. The Mongols wished to ensure that no other city would doubt their power. If Nishapur had been terror, Merv was final proof. Surrender was no guarantee of survival. The Khan's wrath was absolute, and even submission could end in annihilation. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors who fled told of rivers of blood, of fields filled with corpses stretching as far as the eye could see. Chroniclers wrote that each Mongol soldier killed 300 to 400 people, a figure repeated to emphasize the enormity of the destruction. Whether these numbers were precise or exaggerated, the intention was clear: the Mongols wanted the world to remember Merv as a warning. The massacre also revealed the cold logic of Genghis Khan's conquest. By erasing Merv, he eliminated a potential source of resistance. He reduced the population that might rise against him, destroyed the wealth that might fund rebellion, and ensured other cities would surrender without struggle. Terror replaced diplomacy, and fear became empire. For the Islamic world, the fall of Merv was a wound that never healed. Once a beacon of scholarship and trade, the city was left in silence. Travelers who later passed through described ruins where once there had been gardens, ash where there had been schools. The massacre was not only the destruction of a people, but the erasure of a civilization's memory. Historians still debate the numbers, questioning whether hundreds of thousands truly died in Merv. Yet even the lowest estimates place it among the worst massacres of its era. Numbers alone cannot convey the horror: families extinguished, knowledge lost, an entire city turned into a grave. The lesson of Merv echoed across the empire. It revealed the futility of hope, the danger of trust, and the cost of submission. Where mercy was promised, only silence remained. The Mongols had turned deception into strategy and slaughter into legacy. In the empire of Genghis Khan, few crimes were punished with greater cruelty than betrayal. To steal, to lie, or even to disobey could mean mutilation or execution. But to betray the Khan, to abandon him in battle, to surrender without permission, or to conspire against his authority, was considered an attack not just on a ruler, but on destiny itself. The Mongols believed their conquests were the will of the eternal blue sky, a divine mandate that placed Genghis at the center of history. To betray him was not merely treason, it was heresy, a rebellion against the order of the world. And for such crimes, death was not enough. Genghis Khan understood the power of fear. He knew that loyalty born of love was fragile, but loyalty born of terror endured. For this reason, traitors were executed in ways that went beyond killing. Their ends were made into spectacles, reminders to all that disobedience could erase not only a man's life, but his legacy. Accounts tell of generals who faltered in their duty, commanders who surrendered cities too easily, who hesitated to fight, or who negotiated behind the Khan's back. These men were not merely stripped of rank, they were condemned to obliteration. Some were crushed beneath stones until their bones cracked under the weight. Others were executed in secret, their names struck from memory so their deeds could not inspire rebellion. In one story, a general entrusted with the defense of a captured city wavered under pressure and negotiated with the enemy. When the betrayal reached Genghis, he ordered the man's execution in a manner meant to erase him utterly. The general's family was killed, his possessions scattered, and his name forbidden from being spoken. The punishment was not only for him, but for his bloodline, extinguishing any hope of legacy. The Mongols often chose methods of death that denied honor. Among steppe warriors, a clean death in battle was the mark of dignity. To die by the sword, with one's blood on the ground, was acceptable, but traitors were rarely given this end. Instead, they were smothered, strangled, or broken, their blood deliberately kept from touching the soil. This was a symbolic act, to deny them even the honor of feeding the earth with their life. Such punishments reinforced a grim reality under Genghis Khan. Betrayal was not survivable. Even the suspicion of disloyalty could bring doom. His commanders, many of them bound by ties of kinship or alliance, learned that their positions depended entirely on obedience. It was said that Genghis trusted no one completely, not even his own sons. The terror spread downward through the ranks. Common soldiers knew that desertion meant death not only for themselves but for their families. City leaders understood that surrender without permission was itself a betrayal. Even envoys and administrators could be executed if they failed in their duties. The effect was profound. The Mongol army became a force of unmatched discipline. Each man understood that hesitation could be fatal, that wavering could doom not only himself but all he loved. Fear welded the empire together, and the execution of traitors served as the hammer. But this cruelty was not without calculation. Genghis Khan did not punish betrayal simply out of anger. He used it as a tool of statecraft. By making examples of traitors, he ensured obedience among the living. By erasing their names and bloodlines, he prevented martyrs from arising. His punishments were not chaotic. They were deliberate, crafted to send a message that echoed through the steppe and beyond. For the cities that surrendered too quickly, punishment was often the same. Their leaders were executed, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their walls torn down. In Genghis's view, to yield before a fight was not submission but treachery, a refusal to honor the divine destiny of his rule. The people of such cities paid the price, learning that mercy was only given when it served the Khan's will. Historians describe this as the paradox of Genghis Khan, a leader who demanded absolute loyalty but trusted almost no one, who rewarded obedience lavishly but punished betrayal with extermination. His empire grew not only through brilliance in war, but through the terror of what happened to those who disobeyed. The memory of these punishments lingered long after his death. Generals and princes throughout the empire carried with them the knowledge that even the whisper of treachery could destroy them. Families remembered ancestors erased from history, their names struck out, their existence reduced to silence. In this way, betrayal under the Mongols was not just a personal failure but a cosmic crime, and for such crimes, the price was total annihilation. Conquest has always been written in the language of blood and steel, but the deepest wounds were often carved into those who could not fight. When the Mongol armies swept across Asia and into Europe, their victories were measured not only in lands seized and cities destroyed, but in the countless women and children whose lives were shattered in the aftermath. For them, survival meant slavery, degradation, and the quiet endurance of humiliation that left scars long after the battles had ended. The capture of women was not incidental. It was systemic, a deliberate part of conquest. Genghis Khan and his successors treated the distribution of women as a means of rewarding soldiers and binding loyalties. Just as horses and weapons were counted as spoils, so too were human beings. Entire populations were reduced to property, their fate sealed by the outcome of war. For the women of conquered cities, there was no sanctuary. When walls fell, armies surged in with ruthless efficiency. Men of fighting age were often executed to prevent rebellion. What remained were the women, the elderly, and the children. Women were seized for the pleasure of warriors, for forced marriages, or for servitude within the Mongol encampments. The act was not simply one of possession, but of domination, a ritual of conquest that reinforced the total collapse of resistance. Children were no safer. Boys were enslaved to serve in menial roles, stripped of family and identity. raised to labor for those who had destroyed their homes. Girls, often still children themselves, were absorbed into the machinery of sexual servitude. Families were torn apart deliberately, ensuring that bloodlines and kinship ties could not survive to challenge Mongol rule. In many places, the destruction of community was as calculated as the burning of walls and libraries. Historical accounts from Persia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe describe this pattern with chilling regularity. In Nishapur, Herat, Merv, and countless smaller cities, survivors spoke of women carried away in numbers so vast that their absence hollowed entire generations. Chroniclers of the time, many writing with trembling grief, recorded the silent suffering of mothers forced to watch their children sold or slaughtered, their own lives reduced to chains. The fate of noblewomen was particularly symbolic. Capturing and subjugating the wives and daughters of ruling families was a way to erase dynasties and humiliate former rulers. Marriage into the Mongol elite was rarely an honor freely chosen. It was a demonstration of submission, a reminder that even the proudest bloodlines could be absorbed, bent, and erased under the shadow of Mongol power. Slavery within the Mongol world was vast and complex. The empire thrived on mobility and conquest, and enslaved populations were a critical part of this system. Women were distributed across military households, traded as commodities, or forced into the camps as servants and concubines. Their identities disappeared in records that counted them not as individuals, but as property. For every queen remembered in chronicles, thousands of women vanished into silence, their names lost forever. The trauma extended beyond the moment of capture. Survivors lived with daily reminders of their broken status. In some accounts, women enslaved by the Mongols were compelled to serve not only their captors, but also their captors' families, forced into labor that never ceased. Others endured the slow cruelty of assimilation, where their children grew up as Mongols, raised in the culture of those who had destroyed their homes. In this way, even memory itself was conquered. The psychological weight was immense. Chroniclers describe women who chose death over enslavement, leaping into rivers or throwing themselves into flames rather than submit. Others endured, but their silence is its own kind of testimony. The absence of their voices in history is not because they had nothing to say, but because they were denied the chance to speak. The Mongol leadership framed these practices as necessary. To them, conquest was incomplete without the absorption of people as property. Women became currency in the empire, a way of rewarding soldiers and solidifying bonds. By distributing human spoils, Genghis Khan ensured loyalty while instilling terror in the conquered. Resistance seemed futile when the price of defiance was not only death, but the obliteration of one's family, body, and dignity. The long-term consequences were profound. Across Persia, Central Asia, and the Russian steppes, entire communities disappeared. Population estimates after Mongol campaigns show staggering declines, not only from slaughter but from the dispersal and enslavement of women and children. Cultural memory fractured as the descendants of the enslaved lived without ties to their origins. Yet the echoes remain. Persian poets lamented the shattered lives of women who once embroidered palaces but now wove garments for their captors. Russian chronicles spoke of daughters carried away into unknown lands. Even European travelers like Giovanni de Payan del Carpine and William of Rubruck, who witnessed fragments of Mongol rule, described the ubiquity of human servitude in the empire. In the end, the suffering of women under Mongol conquest is one of history's vast silences. Their broken lives are mentioned only in passing, overshadowed by tales of armies, strategies, and great khans. Yet their suffering was as central to the story as any battle, for it was through their bodies and their erasure that conquest was made absolute. Samarkand was not merely a city, it was a beacon. For centuries, it had stood at the crossroads of the Silk Road, a place where Persian, Turkic, and Indian cultures intertwined. Its markets overflowed with silks and spices, its mosques echoed with devotion, and its libraries held the learning of generations. Travelers praised its gardens, its minarets, and its scholars, who debated philosophy beneath domes of turquoise and gold. To its people, Samarkand seemed untouchable, a city blessed by both faith and fortune. That illusion shattered in the spring of 1220, When the Mongol horde arrived at its gates, Genghis Khan had already swept through Central Asia, leaving behind rivers of blood in cities like Bukhara. Samarkand, though proud, understood what awaited those who resisted. Its defenders numbered in the tens of thousands, bolstered by foreign mercenaries. Behind its walls, citizens prayed for salvation, hoping that sheer size and reputation would shield them. But against the Mongols, no city was beyond reach. The siege was swift and merciless. The Mongols encircled the city with precision, cutting off escape. Siege engines pounded the walls, while cavalry slaughtered anyone who attempted to flee. Betrayal hastened the fall. Some within the city, recognizing the futility of resistance, opened the gates. When the Mongols poured in, the defenders collapsed, and Samarkand, once the heart of Transoxiana, became prey. The slaughter began immediately. The men of fighting age were rounded up and executed in groups, their bodies left in piles as warnings. Women and children were dragged from their homes, torn from families in scenes of chaos and despair. The city's population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands according to some chroniclers, was reduced in a matter of days to silence and ruin. Yet the destruction was not blind. The Mongols were methodical in their cruelty. They spared artisans, engineers, and craftsmen who were marked, separated, and enslaved. These individuals were too valuable to waste. They were chained and marched away to serve the empire, constructing siege engines, fortifications, and palaces for their conquerors. For the artisans of Samarkand, survival meant a life in bondage, forced to use their talents for the glory of those who had erased their homeland. The scholars, however, were not so fortunate. The Mongols had little interest in the treasures of knowledge that Samarkand had nurtured. Libraries were ransacked, manuscripts destroyed, and centers of learning burned. The mosques that had been the pride of the city were desecrated, their sanctity mocked by soldiers who viewed faith as powerless before the sword. For Samarkand's intellectual life, the Mongol conquest was a death sentence. Centuries of accumulated wisdom vanished into ash. The cruelty extended beyond slaughter and enslavement. Citizens who had hoped for mercy were executed in staged massacres, their deaths orchestrated to instill terror in the living. Reports describe pyramids of skulls rising where markets once thrived, grim monuments to the futility of defiance. The city that had once been a hub of trade and dialogue became instead a theater of despair. Survivors carried the scars into exile. Families were broken, children scattered, and women forced into servitude. The artisans who were spared saw their skills turned against their own people, compelled to build weapons of destruction for campaigns that spread the same terror across Asia. Their captivity was not freedom, but a chain that bound them to the very empire that had annihilated their city. For the Mongols, Samarkand was not simply a conquest, it was a statement. By annihilating one of the most celebrated cities of the Islamic world, they declared that no center of wealth or learning was beyond their reach. They demonstrated that surrender offered no true safety, only the possibility of survival through submission. The spectacle of destruction was itself a weapon, one that echoed across Central Asia and into the Middle East. The fall of Samarkand left a wound on the region's cultural memory. Persian chroniclers wrote of its devastation with grief and horror, lamenting not only the slaughter of lives, but the erasure of knowledge and beauty. The city's mosques were rebuilt in later generations, its markets revived, but the silence of those who perished remained unbroken. The ghosts of artisans enslaved, of children scattered, of scholars silenced, lingered as a warning carved into history. What made the conquest of Samarkand so devastating was its contrast. A place once radiant with learning and trade was reduced to ruin not by fire alone, but by deliberate cruelty. Its treasures were not merely stolen, they were desecrated. Its citizens were not merely defeated, they were obliterated or enslaved. In this way, Samarkand became a symbol of the Mongol method annihilation coupled with exploitation, terror paired with strategy. Long after the blood had dried and the conquerors moved on, the memory of Samarkand haunted chronicles. To those who remembered, it was not the city of gardens and scholars, but the city of the damned, cursed by its fall into silence. The jewel of the Silk Road had been ground into dust, its brilliance extinguished in a single season of terror. Among the Mongols, war was more than conquest. It was a declaration that no power, no dynasty, no kingdom could rival the supremacy of Genghis Khan and his descendants. For ordinary citizens, defeat meant slaughter or slavery. But for aristocrats, kings, princes, and nobles who had dared to oppose the Mongols, their fate was darker still. Their deaths were not simply executions. They were spectacles of annihilation, designed to erase the idea of sovereignty itself. Genghis Khan understood symbolism. A warrior slain in battle could be honored by his people as a martyr. But a king humiliated, broken, and killed like an animal sent an entirely different message. It declared that crowns, bloodlines, and thrones were powerless against the will of the Khan. Thus, the Mongols reserved their most inventive and degrading punishments for rulers. One of the most infamous methods was the pouring of molten silver or molten metal into the mouths, ears, or eyes of captured nobles. Chroniclers describe this as both torture and metaphor, the burning liquid destroying from within, a punishment reflecting greed and failed ambition. It was said to be inflicted on Inalchok, the governor of Otrar, whose betrayal of Mongol envoys had provoked one of Genghis Khan's most brutal campaigns. His execution was remembered not simply as revenge, but as a warning that betrayal of the Khan meant death of unspeakable cruelty. Other aristocrats faced suffocation, a punishment chosen with deliberate care. Mongol culture held a taboo against spilling royal blood on the earth, believing that it could offend the eternal blue sky. To honor this belief while still exacting vengeance, nobles were often killed without shedding blood. They were wrapped in carpets or rugs, trampled by horses, or slowly suffocated beneath crushing weight. To onlookers, this preserved the ritual purity of the earth, while ensuring the victim's death was degrading and unforgettable. The humiliation did not end with death. In some cases, nobles were forced to endure acts that stripped them of dignity before execution. They were paraded, mocked, or compelled to bow before the Khan, acknowledging their inferiority before being destroyed. The ritual breaking of pride was as important as the act of killing itself. By reducing kings to groveling captives, Genghis Khan ensured that their people would see not martyrs, but broken men. The practice continued under his successors. When the Mongols crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, its rulers suffered merciless ends. Later, during Hulagu Khan's conquest of Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim was executed not by sword, but by suffocation, rolled in a carpet and trampled. His death symbolized the erasure of one of Islam's most sacred dynasties. The message was unmistakable. Even a caliph, seen by millions as the successor of the Prophet, could not claim authority above the will of the Mongols. The Mongols' methods reflected both pragmatism and terror. To kill nobles publicly, in ways remembered for generations, was to destroy the idea of resistance. If kings themselves could be crushed, then what hope did their subjects have? The executions became political theater, each act a demonstration of Mongol supremacy that spread fear across empires. Yet these deaths also carried cultural weight. Steppe traditions valued the symbolism of power, and execution methods often matched the perceived crimes of the victim. Greedy rulers were punished with molten wealth. Betrayers were erased silently, suffocated without the honor of blood. Defiant kings were trampled, treated no differently from beasts of burden. Each punishment told a story, one that reinforced the inevitability of Mongol rule. For the conquered, these deaths were devastating. Nobles had long been the pillars of political order, the protectors of lineage, and the symbols of stability. To watch them humiliated and destroyed shattered more than morale. It dissolved faith in dynasties themselves. Subjects left behind had no rallying figure, no royal bloodline to inspire rebellion. The executions achieved not only vengeance, but permanent destabilization. Chroniclers wrote of these acts with horror, but also with reluctant awe. They saw in them not random cruelty, but calculated theater. The Mongols knew that memory itself was a weapon, and the memory of aristocrats destroyed in such ways would spread faster than armies. The fear it created subdued cities long before a single arrow was loosed. Thus, the fate of captured kings was sealed from the moment of their defeat. To surrender was not to be spared, but to be broken. The crown on their head, the blood in their veins, the titles they bore, All were meaningless before the Lord of the Steppe. Conquest requires more than strength of arms. It requires the breaking of will, the collapse of resistance before battles are fought. Genghis Khan understood this truth better than any ruler of his age. Violence was not only a tool for destruction, it was a performance. Executions, massacres, and staged cruelty were not random acts of rage, but rituals designed to transform fear into a weapon sharper than any blade. The Mongols waged psychological war as carefully as they waged battle. Wherever they marched, stories of their cruelty spread ahead of them. Chroniclers record how rumors of entire cities being slaughtered, of pyramids of skulls built from the dead, or of nobles suffocated beneath carpets traveled across the Silk Road with terrifying speed. By the time Mongol horsemen appeared on the horizon, many communities had already been conquered by dread alone. This was no accident. Genghis Khan cultivated fear deliberately, ensuring that his name itself inspired submission. His punishments were crafted to be remembered, and survivors were often left alive, not out of mercy, but to carry the tale of horror onward. In this way, terror galloped faster than his armies, softening cities before the first arrow was loosed. One of the most potent rituals of fear was the public massacre. When a city resisted, its destruction was methodical and highly visible. Populations were divided, executed in groups, and their bodies displayed as warnings. In Nishapur and Merv, chroniclers describe pyramids of skulls stacked in the ruins, ghastly monuments intended not only for the present but for the future. Generations later, travelers still spoke of these mountains of bone, testaments to the power of Mongol terror. Torture itself was wielded as language. Captured leaders or traitors were executed in ways that spoke to deeper meaning. Some were crushed slowly under weight, their suffering prolonged to emphasize the futility of defiance. Others were boiled alive, their deaths turning into grim theater for all who watched. The Mongols selected punishments not for efficiency, but for symbolism, each act a story, a ritual of fear engraved upon memory. The executions of nobles carried particular weight. A king suffocated in a carpet or a governor burned with molten silver was not merely a death, but a declaration. These rituals stripped the defeated of dignity, showing their subjects that even the highest could be made to grovel. To witness a ruler humiliated and destroyed dissolved faith in crowns and dynasties. Fear flowed downward, infecting entire populations. Even religious sites were not spared from these rituals of domination. Mosques, churches, and temples were desecrated, their sanctity trampled in acts designed to prove that faith itself could not shield the faithful. When Baghdad fell, its great libraries and mosques were reduced to rubble, their destruction as symbolic as the rivers of blood. The act was not only about conquest, it was about unmaking the sacred, replacing reverence with dread. The Mongols also used deception as a weapon of terror. They would promise mercy to a surrendering city, only to massacre its people after the gates were opened. This ritualized betrayal spread further fear, for it taught survivors that even surrender held no safety. Each broken promise multiplied terror, ensuring that submission carried the same dread as resistance. To the Mongols, these acts were not random cruelty, they were calculated strategy. Fear reduced the cost of war. Cities that might have resisted instead opened their gates, desperate to avoid the fate they had heard whispered in the tales of refugees. The Khan's armies could advance faster, conserve strength, and overwhelm enemies before battle began. Terror, in this sense, became the most efficient weapon of empire. Yet the human toll was immense. Families lived with memories of neighbors impaled, of children slaughtered, of rulers humiliated in front of their people. Survivors bore scars that outlived the empire itself, carrying stories of Mongol cruelty across continents. To this day, medieval chronicles record these horrors with a mixture of disbelief and despair, unable to fathom the scale of fear that spread like wildfire across Asia and Europe. For the Mongols, however, fear was not shameful. It was power. Genghis Khan himself is said to have declared that it was better to be feared than loved. His empire embodied this creed. It thrived on dread, advancing not only through strength, but through the memory of cruelty, repeated until resistance became unthinkable. In the heart of the Mongol steppe, Where the Orkhon River cut through barren plains, Genghis Khan and his heirs forged a capital from the spoils of empire, Karakorum, a name that once carried the weight of fear across the world, stood not as a city of peace, but as a monument to blood. It was built with wealth torn from empires, its rise made possible only through the destruction of others. Behind its walls lay treasures looted from Persia, Russia, China, and beyond. Its streets bore the footfalls of slaves torn from their homelands, forced into servitude for their conquerors. Every brick, every stone, carried the weight of tragedy. Karakorum was an empire's jewel, but its shine was polished with blood. Chroniclers describe how artisans were spared from slaughter not out of mercy, but because they were useful. Carpenters, masons, metal workers, and scribes were dragged across continents to labor in the steppe capital. They built temples, fortresses, and palaces for rulers who despised their weakness but exploited their skills. For every master craftsman who lived, thousands of his people had perished. Karakorum's beauty, such as it was, rose on the bones of the conquered. At its height, Karakorum glittered with contradictions. Temples to many gods stood side by side, Buddhist stupas, Muslim mosques, Christian churches, for the Mongols cared little for faith except as a means of control. Religious leaders were tolerated only so long as they did not threaten the Khan's supremacy. Here, beneath the surface of tolerance, was a deeper reality. Belief itself was enslaved, reduced to ornamentation for Mongol power. Markets overflowed with goods, but the trade that sustained them had been built on plunder. Silk caravans from China, spices from India, and gold from the West all flowed into Karakorum, filling its bazaars with wonders. Yet each luxury bore the silent cries of those who had been robbed, enslaved, or killed to supply it. Prosperity here was parasitic. The wealth of nations fed the hunger of one empire, while the corpses of the defeated fertilized its soil. Foreign envoys described Karakorum with awe, but also unease. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who visited in the mid-13th century, marveled at its palaces, but also noted its strangeness, a city that seemed stitched together from fragments of the world, yet with no soul of its own. For all its wealth, Karakorum was a city without roots. It was less a home than a scar on the steppe, a monument to conquest. Beneath the surface grandeur, human misery festered. Slaves toiled in anonymity, their lives extinguished without record. Women from conquered lands filled the harems of Mongol nobles, their bodies treated as plunder. Children grew up in bondage, never knowing the lands from which their ancestors had been stolen. For these countless voices, Karakorum was not a capital of empire, but a prison of grief. And yet, for the Mongols, Karakorum symbolized triumph. Here stood proof that the nomads of the steppe, once dismissed as barbarians, had not only destroyed the great empires of Asia, but had risen above them. Where once there had been only felt tents and herds of horses, now there were palaces lined with silver and markets overflowing with tribute. The Khan's court echoed with ambassadors speaking every tongue of the known world. Karakorum was both a city and a statement. The Mongols ruled all, and their reach was limitless. But behind this facade lay fragility. The city was built on fear, not loyalty, on conquest, not creation. Its wealth was not produced, but extracted. Its people were not citizens, but captives. Like the empire itself, Karakorum was a house of bones, held together by violence and the memory of terror. The moment conquest ceased, the foundations would begin to rot. The rituals of cruelty that had forged the empire haunted the city as well. Executions were carried out in the public squares, their brutality reminding all that power flowed only from the Khan. Nobles were put to death in elaborate displays, their agony made into lessons for the masses. Even within the capital, terror was a constant companion. The grandeur of Karakorum was inseparable from its shadows. Historians often describe Karakorum as a crossroads, a place where East met West, where cultures mingled under Mongol rule. But the truth was darker. It was not a crossroads, but a crucible. Cultures were not blended here in harmony. They were broken and reforged under the iron hand of empire. What appeared as diversity was, in truth, domination. When the Mongol capital eventually shifted to Khanbalik, later Beijing, Karakorum began to wither. Its palaces crumbled, its markets emptied, and its name faded into memory. What remained was silence, a city swallowed by the steppe, remembered less for what it was than for what it represented. Karakorum was never just a capital. It was the embodiment of conquest itself, a monument to human suffering disguised as imperial glory. Every treasure within its walls carried the echo of screams, every stone the memory of a massacre. Its rise was written in blood, its foundations cemented with bones. In 1227, Genghis Khan died during a campaign against the Western Shia. The exact cause of his death remains debated. Some chronicles speak of illness, others of injury. But what mattered was not how he died, but what he left behind. At the time of his passing, his empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. It was the largest land empire the world had ever known. Yet its foundations were not built on harmony, but on violence. His true legacy was not a realm of unity, but an inheritance of fear. The memory of his conquests haunted the lands he had ravaged. In China, entire regions remained depopulated, their fields left fallow because the peasants who once worked them lay buried in mass graves. In Central Asia, cities such as Nishapur and Merv stood as ruins, their names remembered not for their culture, but for their slaughter. In Persia, the pyramids of skulls left behind by Mongol armies served as grim reminders of what resistance meant. The Mongols codified terror into law. The Yasa, their legal code, enshrined merciless punishments for theft, betrayal, or defiance. Death was often not limited to the guilty, but extended to families, clans, even entire communities. Mercy was weakness, obedience was survival. These laws outlasted Genghis himself, carried forward by his heirs as instruments of domination. The terror he had perfected became an inheritance, binding the conquered through fear long after his grave was sealed. For those who lived under Mongol dominion, the psychological scars were as enduring as the physical devastation. Tales of Mongol cruelty spread faster than their armies, and long after Genghis was gone, his name alone remained a weapon. Parents in Persia and Russia frightened disobedient children by whispering the name, Chinggis. The memory of the steppe riders became a ghost story, a warning that cruelty could strike without warning, and that no wall, no city, no crown could protect against it. Historians debate Genghis Khan's legacy, some pointing to the stability of trade routes, the so-called Pax Mongolica, or the tolerance his empire showed toward religions. But to focus on these fragments of order is to ignore the rivers of blood upon which they were built. The silk and spices that flowed along reopened roads were stained with the lives of those slaughtered to secure them. The apparent tolerance of faiths was less benevolence than indifference, so long as no god stood above the Khan. What endured most was not prosperity, but trauma. In the centuries that followed, entire cultures struggled to recover. Libraries that had once preserved centuries of learning lay in ashes. Mosques and temples that had been the heart of communities were left in ruin. Populations diminished to a fraction of their former strength, leaving empty fields and crumbling walls where once there had been cities. The Mongols had not merely conquered, they had erased. Even within their own empire, the legacy was soaked in blood. Succession after Genghis's death was marked not by peaceful transfer, but by fratricide and civil war. His sons and grandsons, inheritors of his cruelty, turned the same methods of terror upon each other. The empire that had been built on bones soon began to consume itself, yet the shadow of Genghis Khan stretched beyond his dynasty. The stories of his atrocities shaped the way entire regions perceived power. Rulers who came after him learned that terror could be as effective as armies, that cruelty could govern more surely than law. His model of domination, swift, brutal, and absolute, echoed in the strategies of conquerors for centuries. From Timur in Central Asia to the tyrants of later eras, the lesson of Genghis Khan was repeated fear commands obedience. But the cost of such a legacy was immense. Where Genghis rode, civilizations collapsed. Where his banners flew, memory itself fractured. To this day, in the lands he devastated, ruins still testify to his passage. Cities once famed for their beauty survive only as archaeological remains. Families that trace their lineage for centuries ended in silence. The cultural wounds of his campaigns never fully healed. When the name of Genghis Khan is spoken today, it carries two faces. In Mongolia, he is remembered as a unifier, a national hero who raised his people from obscurity to power. But beyond the steppes, his memory is darker. He is remembered as the destroyer of worlds, a figure whose conquests left millions dead and entire cultures in ruin. His empire may have crumbled, but the terror it unleashed has endured in history's collective memory.